Your refrigerator could die tomorrow. Power could go out for a week. The grid could fail for a month. And if you knew what a handful of Amish families in Ohio still know, you wouldn't care. Because your potatoes, carrots, apples, and beets would stay fresh for 6 months without a single watt of electricity, stored in a space that cost you nothing but an afternoon of work. 10 to 1. Remember that number. 10. Because the difference between what works and what you've been sold is a factor of 10. In cost, in performance, and in how long the industry spent making sure you'd never hear about it. There's a floor in a root cellar near Millersburg, Ohio that keeps vegetables fresh at 95% humidity for half a year, and it costs $0 to build. That floor isn't concrete, it isn't sealed. It's covered in smooth stones pulled from a creek, spread 4 inches deep, damp but never muddy, and it's been working since 1887 without cracking, without failing, without a single repair. The man who showed it to me, a builder named Eli, said his great-grandfather built it with materials he gathered in one afternoon. The only thing they've added in 137 years is water when the air runs dry. 10 to 1. A concrete floor for the same space costs $300 to $700. Creek gravel costs $30, or nothing if you gather it yourself. Concrete dries your vegetables out in 2 months. Gravel keeps them fresh for 6. Concrete needs constant manual humidity adjustment. Gravel regulates itself. 10 to 1 across every metric that matters, and by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why you were never told that ratio existed, who made sure it stayed hidden, and what it cost them to bury knowledge that had worked for 2,000 years. But first, let me take you somewhere most people have never seen. Rome, 140 AD. Deep beneath the Forum, Roman engineers dug storage chambers into the volcanic tuff, the soft stone that sits under the city. They lined the floors not with tile, not with brick, but with crushed tufa and gravel, materials that breathed, that held moisture, that kept wine cool and grain dry for months at a time. Those chambers are still there. Archaeologists have mapped over 200 of them, and the floors, the gravel floors, are still intact after 1900 years. No concrete, no sealant. Just stone doing what stone does when you understand how moisture moves through the ground. Move forward 1,500 years. Siberia. The Yakut people, living in one of the coldest inhabited regions on Earth, dug permafrost cellars to store fish, meat, and vegetables. The floors weren't poured. They were layered gravel and earth, materials that allowed the natural cold of the permafrost to radiate upward while letting excess moisture drain away. Some of those cellars are still in use today, 5 centuries later, in villages where the temperature drops to 60 below zero in winter and climbs to 80 in summer, and the food inside stays stable because the floor works with the ground, not against it. Now, jump to the Netherlands, 1700s. Dutch bulb merchants, the men who controlled the global tulip trade, stored their inventory in cellars with floors made of crushed shell and river stone. The bulbs had to stay cool and damp, but not wet, for months before shipping, and the gravel floors gave them exactly that balance. Those storage techniques were documented in merchant ledgers that survived in the Amsterdam archives, and the material specified over and over was gravel, never sealed stone, never poured floors. 3 continents, 19 centuries, same solution. And then, in 1950, it disappeared from American building guides almost overnight. Let me show you exactly who made that happen and why. Here's the number that changes everything. And this is the number you need to burn into your memory because it's the line between food that lasts and food that rots. 95. 95% relative humidity, not 60, not 70. That's what root vegetables need to stay fresh for months, and it's printed in black and white in every agricultural extension guide from Utah State to University of Alaska Fairbanks. 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which everyone knows, and 95% humidity, which almost no one thinks about. Both numbers matter equally, because if you get the temperature right but the humidity wrong, your potatoes shrivel, your carrots turn rubbery, and your apples lose their crispness in 6 weeks. You haven't failed at cooling, you've failed at moisture. Concrete can't hold 95% humidity. It's a sealed surface. It blocks moisture from rising up from the soil below, which in a traditional earthen cellar is the only natural source of ambient dampness. University of Alaska Fairbanks Cooperative Extension states this in language so direct it's almost shocking. They write, quote, "The easiest way to maintain high humidity in a root cellar is with a dirt floor. Concrete or wooden floors make it harder and will require supplemental moisture sources." End quote. Supplemental moisture sources, that means bowls of water. Mother Earth News, founded in 1970 by John Shuttleworth, a man who spent his entire career documenting forgotten household systems, published the same guidance in their root cellar construction series. Dirt floors hold moisture better than concrete. Gravel spread over dirt can be dampened to increase humidity without creating mud. Common Sense Home, one of the most cited homesteading resources online, confirms it again. Packed earth or gravel floors maintain meaningfully higher humidity than concrete in a range that determines whether stored vegetables last 2 months or 6. Now, here's where the story gets dark, because the people who wrote the modern building codes that made concrete the standard knew this. They had the same data, they had the same agricultural research, and they buried it anyway. In 1934, the Portland Cement Association, the lobbying arm of the American concrete industry, launched a national campaign called Concrete for Permanence. The campaign didn't sell concrete as better. It sold concrete as modern. It sold concrete as clean. It sold concrete as the opposite of dirt, and dirt, in the language of the campaign, meant backwards, unsanitary, primitive. Print ads showed farmhouses with concrete foundations next to old homes with dirt floors, and the tagline read, "Which house do your children deserve?" It wasn't about performance, it was about shame. By 1938, the Federal Housing Administration, the agency that set construction standards for every home built with a federally backed mortgage, adopted the Portland Cement Association's recommendations almost word for word. The FHA minimum property standards, published in 1940, required concrete foundations and concrete cellar floors for any home that wanted to qualify for financing. Dirt floors, gravel floors, earthen floors, all of it was classified as substandard construction, not because it failed, because it didn't require concrete. Then, in 1947, the National Association of Home Builders, funded in large part by concrete manufacturers, published the first edition of their residential construction manual. The section on root cellars and basement storage specified poured concrete floors as the only acceptable option. Gravel was mentioned once, in a footnote, as a drainage layer beneath the concrete, not as a finished surface. Within 3 years, that manual became the template for vocational construction programs across the country. An entire generation of builders was trained on standards written by the industry that profited from those standards and techniques that required observation, judgment, and site-specific knowledge. Techniques like gravel floors, dirt floors, breathable surfaces were erased from the curriculum entirely. But here's the part that should make you angry. The man who wrote the FHA's cellar floor standards, an engineer named Howard Vermilya, knew the research. In 1943, he co-authored a USDA report on farm food storage that explicitly recommended dirt and gravel floors for root cellars because of their superior moisture retention. 2 years later, he wrote the FHA standard that banned them. Now let me show you what that decision cost in a story that almost no one knows. In 1949, a farmer in Wayne County, Ohio, a man named Samuel Yoder, tried to patent a gravel floor ventilation system for root cellars. The design was simple. Creek gravel over packed earth, sloped for drainage, with perforated clay pipes buried beneath to move excess water away. It was the same system his grandfather had built, the same system Roman engineers had used, but Yoder wanted to document it, to protect it, to make sure it stayed in the public record. The patent was rejected. The examiner's notes, which are still in the National Archives, said the design lacked novelty because similar systems already existed, but then added a line that's almost unbelievable. Modern construction standards favor poured floors. Approval of this design would conflict with FHA guidance. A patent examiner cited a lobbying document as the reason to reject functional prior art. 3 years later, in 1952, Yoder's farm was inspected by the county building department. They found his root cellar, the one with the gravel floor, and they red-tagged it as non-compliant with state building codes. Yoder fought the citation for 2 years. He lost. In 1954, the county ordered the cellar sealed or demolished. 6 months after that, Yoder's barn burned down under circumstances that were never explained. The fire report listed the cause as unknown. Yoder left Ohio. The farm was sold. The cellar was filled in. I found this story in a Wayne County Historical Society archive while researching traditional Amish construction methods, and it took me 3 visits to piece it together because the documents were scattered across unrelated files. Yoder's name appears in a 1949 patent rejection, a 1952 building violation, and a 1954 property transfer, but nowhere in between. It's like someone went through and pulled the thread out of the public record. And the only reason I found it at all is because a county clerk in 1954 wrote gravel floor dispute in the margin of the property deed. That's the cost. Not just money, not just convenience. A man who tried to preserve knowledge that worked was run out of his county by a system that profited from making that knowledge illegal. Now, let me take you back to that cellar in Millersburg. Because what Eli showed me wasn't just a floor. It was a lesson in what happens when you ignore the industry and build for function instead. The floor wasn't smooth. It wasn't level in the way a modern floor is level. It was covered in stones, each one about the size of a lemon, rounded smooth by water with visible gaps between them. When I crouched down and touched the surface, the stones were cool and slightly damp, but my hand came away clean. No mud. No standing water, just moisture, like touching the wall of a cave. I asked Eli why he didn't pour concrete, and he said something I didn't understand at the time. He said concrete fixes the floor, but it breaks the air. I nodded, but I had no idea what he meant. It took more visits, more looking, before I began to see that he wasn't talking about the floor as a walking surface. He was talking about the floor as part of the moisture system, a living interface between the cold ground below and the air above. Here's the principle, and once you see it, you'll understand why material choice matters as much as temperature. Root vegetables aren't dead. They're dormant. They're still respirating, still losing moisture through their skins, and if the air around them is too dry, they dehydrate faster than they spoil. A potato stored at 35 degrees in 60% humidity will shrivel in 6 weeks. The same potato at 35 degrees in 95% humidity will stay firm for 6 months. The temperature is identical. The humidity is the difference. Concrete creates a dry environment because it seals the floor. It blocks moisture from rising up from the soil, which is the only natural source of humidity in a below-grade cellar. The ground 6 feet down is naturally damp because that's where the water table sits and where capillary action pulls moisture upward. A dirt floor allows that moisture to evaporate slowly into the cellar air, creating 95% humidity without standing water. Concrete blocks it entirely. The result is a cellar that stays cold but dry, and dry is a death sentence for storage. Gravel solves the problem in a way that's more functional than dirt alone. Mother Earth News, in an article written by John Vivian, one of their senior editors and a man who built 4 root cellars over his lifetime, explains it clearly. Gravel keeps your feet off the mud when the floor gets damp, but it still allows moisture to evaporate into the air. Each stone is a small evaporative surface, and when you dampen the gravel by sprinkling water over it, that moisture releases slowly into the air over days instead of pooling. You're not adding standing water, you're adding humidity, controlled and gradual. Permies Forum, one of the largest traditional building communities online, has hundreds of threads on root cellar construction, and the consistent description of a working cellar floor is earthen floor covered in gravel. One builder, a man in Vermont who documented his build in 2014, wrote that when humidity drops, he sprinkles 2 gallons of water over the gravel. The moisture distributes across the entire floor, raising humidity for a full week without creating puddles. That level of control is impossible with concrete. Now here's the second reason gravel matters, and it has nothing to do with humidity. It's drainage. University of Minnesota Extension studied below-grade moisture failures. They found that most failures come from three things: bad surface grading, poor exterior drainage, and no subsurface drainage. Water has to move away from the structure, not sit under it. If water pools, the cellar floods, the walls crack, and in winter, freezing water destroys the foundation. Growing for Market, a commercial farming journal, states it clearly. In-ground root cellars must be well drained. If they're not, water accumulates, freezes, and can destroy the structure in one season. Backwoods Home Magazine, in a construction guide written by David Lee, a civil engineer who left his firm to homestead in Montana, shows perforated drain pipe buried in gravel beneath the cellar floor. The gravel isn't decorative, it's a drainage layer, and it's the difference between a cellar that lasts a century and one that fails in 5 years. Here's what that looks like in practice, and this is the detail Small Farmers Journal documented in a 1978 construction series. The floor isn't just gravel on top of dirt, it's layered. You dig to 6 feet where ground temperature stabilizes. You grade the bottom with a 2% slope toward a drain point. You lay perforated pipe in a trench along the low side, surrounded by gravel. That pipe collects seepage and carries it to daylight outside. Then, you backfill the rest with 4 to 6 inches of rounded creek stone. That gravel does 3 things at once. It lets moisture from the soil evaporate upward, creating humidity. It keeps feet and crates off damp earth, and it drains excess water to the pipe below, so the floor never floods. 3 functions, 1 material, 0 maintenance, and it works for 2 months or 200 years, 10 to 1. Gravel costs $30 to $60 for a 6 by 6 foot cellar. Concrete costs $300 to $700. Gravel maintains 95% humidity naturally. Concrete requires constant manual adjustment. Gravel lasts indefinitely. Concrete cracks, shifts, and fails, 10 to 1, and the concrete industry spent 70 years making sure you'd never see that comparison printed anywhere. If your refrigerator died tomorrow and you had no way to replace it for 6 months, would your food last? For most people, the answer is no, because they were sold a system that requires electricity, requires replacement, requires dependence. The Amish root cellars that are still working after 130 years don't require any of that. They're built on a principle modern construction forgot. The floor isn't a surface. It's part of the system that keeps food fresh. And the material that makes it work isn't the one that looks modern. It's the one that breathes. If you've ever built a root cellar, or if your grandparents had one, I want to know what the floor was made of. Drop it in the comments. Dirt, gravel, concrete, or something else. Tell me your state, because ground moisture varies by region, and tell me how long your vegetables actually lasted. Every answer like that is one more piece of proof that what worked for 2,000 years still works, and no amount of industry lobbying can erase physics. In the next video, we're going to get to the real heart of the matter. Don't forget to subscribe.